Next, Senator Siri Carney, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much. Actually, that particular line of questioning with Deputy O'Callaghan has been is very relevant to one of the aspects that I want to question you about or seek your advice on. So I want to focus particularly on Section 97 and Section 303, and that is about it's relevant to locus standi for appeal for of a planning authority decision. So, in a general, I am aware of a particular application or process, all right? So, without getting into the nitty-gritty of it, but the timeline of this application, so it was a large-scale residential development. The timeline for application was the 13th of June. The decision by the local authority was the 4th of August last year. It was appealed to On Board Panola, and that decision was on the 1st of February. So we're within, an 8-month period. It's gone through initial application, decision local authority, On Board Panola. So can I have that parked up here as being a timeline that has operated? The local authority, in their decision making about this, cited 2 reasons for rejecting it. One was that the servicing arrangement would have caused a traffic hazard, and the second one was the car parking didn't meet the standards of the car parking standards that was published. So they were the 2 reasons that the local authority turned down this LRD. On Board Panola's decision on it was based on, number 1, that it didn't meet the zoning, that it was it was zoned for educational and recreational purposes, and it didn't meet nothing could be demonstrated that it was we should set aside that zoning and go into the exceptions and allow residential development on it. This is one. Number 2 was that it was on a floodplain, a flood risk zone B, in accordance with a department publication from 2009. And the third was that the density way exceeded the development plan. But even going on the first 2, the contrast between the decision making of the local authority and the rather trite reasons they cited for rejection versus On Board Panola's much more in-depth and much more in keeping with what a lot of the objections were, rejections, it is quite, considerable, to say the least. So that brings me into the actual process of residents, of people, and what processes within this bill that would afford the raising of a lot of those issues. So a lot of the observations were put in by local residents in the main, some of who had competencies around environment and were aware of flood risks and things like that, and were able to articulate those sorts of things. But some of them were, basic, you're putting up 400, you're providing 100 parking spaces, where the hell is everybody else going to park even if you're going up 50%? Some of the rest of it was that in quality of life issues. So if we look at the provisions in Section 97 and Section 303, an appeal, first of all, has to be from the person who made the application, but then any person who made a submission. So that's fair enough if all these individuals have made a submission, but then we engage the answers to Cian's questions in whether that person is then exposed to risks of costs, what the taxing master would decide, and all that down the road. If you were to then go, if that hadn't gone, if they needed to make a judicial review, if things like that, if it had gone down that. But in order to make an appeal, then you have unincorporated entities, so likes of residents associations, and in that they require that the name, and addresses of all of the members. And I am aware, I can't for the life of me find it this morning, but I'm aware of a decision that was made around the Malahide Road where an agent tried to put in an objection, and it was ruled out by the High Court on the basis as the names and addresses of every member was not listed appropriately. So the locus standi was challenged. But residents' associations tend to bring in members on the basis of the household. So number 26 is a member of the Residents Association, they paid a fee. Not every member of that house. And so I think that there's a potential deficiency there in how tightly that is defined, and that would put Residents Association on the back foot. But one of the things we've started seeing in the last couple of years to try and limit the costs exposure has been local residents incorporating, setting up a limited company so as to limit those who are exposed to costs if it were to go to judicial review. So when the application goes in and the submissions to that application are going in, they will form a company at that point, have the members of the company and move forward at that point. However, then under 303, we have the restrictions that the company must be formed for over a year. It must have environmental objectives. They must be pursuing those objections for over a year, and it must have not less than 10 members. So the problem with that is, if a residents association had got that route in the development I've just outlined to you, they'd never have made that timeline. They would never have had those protections. They would never have had. So I think that there's a drafting sleight of hand going on almost to prevent that very situation. So I'm interested to hear your response to that, of have you considered those limitations in locus standi and where we're at on it?
That's interesting, and I think we'll need to look more closely at 97 and 303. Just looking at it and the restrictions you're referring there in 97, I think that relates to allowing certain persons to be eligible to appeal if they haven't made a submission to the planning authority. Okay. So you only need to meet those criteria if you haven't made a submission to the planning authority, I think. Though perhaps it could nonetheless need to be looked at as to why all these requirements are necessary at this point in the process. So once you can satisfy that you're a person, and a person can be an unincorporated association, I think, who've made submissions to the planning authority, you can appeal, or indeed if you decide to incorporate at that point and that incorporated body has made a submission to the planning authority, then they should be able to come in on think under 97B, and they don't need to meet the criteria that you've been listing there, which seek to carve out an exception to the requirement to have made submissions in relation to certain ENGO. But I know that there are perhaps questions, as you were saying, as to the extent to which maybe people need to be listed in names and addresses and that. But I don't know, Tom, if you have any.
Well, I mean, it does seem that the bill is proposing language which would seem to be restrictive to the status quo. And I mean, there's two arguments, as I understand, against this. I mean, I think there's some developers would argue that there has been a phenomenon of companies being objectors or challenges being instigated by companies which have been established very, very quickly. Yeah. And maybe, and this is contested now, and maybe, for example, they aren't particularly representative of all of the residents within an area. It may be just a couple of individuals in relation to it. And to be blunt, some residents or some developers would have questions over the bona fides of those objectors and over the bona fides of that challenge. Okay. That is heavily contested. There would be people who would say that if there are those cases, they're very, very minor cases, and the vast majority of cases are taken by bona fide applicants, and it's legitimate for residents to set up limited liability companies. That's been going on for a long period of time. To bring forward a challenge and also to confer them with a degree of cost. I suspect it's the concerns of developers that may be motivated behind some of that litigation in that wording in the statute and the restrictions in relation to it. It is more restrictive, it seems to me, than the status quo, and it's something that needs to be analysed and see whether it could operate unfairly in relation to it.
Yeah, because that goes to the heart of a lot of when this was first talked about, of residents thinking we're going to be cut out of the loop here. And because if we stay in and we're stayers ourselves and we appeal and we need to go down the JR route, then we're exposed to costs.
Well, particularly with the new cost provisions which we've been discussing at length.
Yeah.
Not only may they be, well, they may have the protection of the cost rule, that's not clear, but their difficulty may be getting legal representation if their lawyers, even if successful, can't recover.
Yeah. So, given that experience of an LRD where the local authority, in my mind, just came up with the first two things that crossed their mind, to then make sure it got kicked up to on board Penala, resigned to the fact that it was going to anyway. You would need to make sure that everybody had the right of appeal in that scene if we were to see patterns like that.
See the point you're making about the list of members, that certainly seems to be a change in 303 and something that we can look at.
It is more restrictive than the current.
Yeah, okay, so we just need to note that in our own submission, Chair. I'm glad, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Siri Carney. Go to